Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Brummer, and I'm the faculty director at Georgetown's Institute of International Economic Law, and it is a great pleasure to talk to you today. A special welcome also to our speakers, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. I am delighted and honored that they will be joining us shortly to celebrate Black History Month. Now, before we start, I would also like to thank our co-host, the International Monetary Fund, for their support in making today's important conversation happen, and to Visa for their continued partnership, which supports our work on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Georgetown. Now, Black History Month is a special occasion. It is an opportunity to look back and forward, and perhaps above else, it is an opportunity to be seen. After all, Black history is the art of making the unseen seen here in the United States, the art of making not just the recognition of a people, of a global diaspora, but really the recognition of world history and international affairs and putting it into context. It is the art of understanding and interpreting the present and predicting the future while understanding the past. Now, Black History Month itself has a very interesting history. The holiday was started by the great African-American historian Carter G. Woodson in 1926 to designate a time to promote and educate people about Black history and culture. At first envisioned as a week-long opportunity to encourage the coordinated teaching of Black history in public schools in the United States, the holiday would take deep roots here in the U.S., and take off internationally as well, officially recognized as holidays in Canada, Ireland, in the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and celebrated in many parts of the world, including the Caribbean. Now, we're continuing the celebration here in Washington, D.C. with that international mindset and celebrating the continuing story and spirit of the month with a look into Africa's place in the international monetary and financial systems. In many ways, the story is one true to Black history of resilience. In sub-Saharan Africa, GDP growth since 2000 has averaged 5% per year, and between then and 2019, nearly 400 million people were lifted out of poverty. And the demographic trends point in the continent's favor as well. Africa will have 24 million more people on average living in cities each year between 2015 and 2045, more than India and China combined. Spending by consumers and businesses in Africa totals $4 trillion, and some experts estimate household consumption to grow by over 3% annually until 2025. But, as is often the case, there's a long way to go. Although the continent accounts for around 17% of the world's population and growing, it comprises roughly 3% of the world's GDP, all against the backdrop of an unprecedented pandemic and deep structural changes to the global economy. So where do we go from here? Well, we have quite literally two of the best people in the world to help us think it through. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the first woman, the first African to serve as the Director General, the highest position at the World Trade Organization, and she will be joining us today, and the head, as I mentioned, of the International Monetary Fund, Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, the only second woman to ever serve in that role, and a leading figure on issues ranging from financial stability to economic opportunity and empowerment. So let's call them onto the stage, if one will, to really think through some of these very important issues. These are two world leaders, two trailblazers, and it's really a treat for having both of you here to talk to us. But first, just to make a quick pivot here, there is, of course, history upon us at the moment with the events in the Ukraine, and I do want to acknowledge that. And there's obviously a lot of talk this morning about finance, about the global economy, and where we're all headed, this is really of central importance and a central role to the IMF. Um, uh, uh, Managing Director, maybe you could just provide us with a brief observation, or maybe even a statement as to really what's your take on where things are for the international community and for global policymakers like yourself.
Thank you, Chris, for starting with that. Let me first reflect on how harsh this is on ordinary people. They're always those who bear the brunt of dramatic developments as those we see in Ukraine, and my heart goes to them. From a economic standpoint, what is happening, of course, has implications for the economy of Ukraine, but the impact is going to go beyond Ukraine for three reasons. First, because we have already seen actions taken in terms of sanctions that would add to the economic impact of this crisis and will transmit primarily through energy prices as well as grain prices, adding to what has been a growing concern of inflation and how it can be countered. Secondly, there are implications for the functioning of the financial system. Whenever there is uncertainty, and let's remember we stepped into the events in Ukraine from a position of higher uncertainty in the world economy, that uncertainty impacts confidence in emerging markets, and often we see outflows from emerging markets when we need exactly the opposite, more financing going there. And third, we need to recognize that there would be implications in the neighborhood because some of the countries, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Moldova, are more economically connected, but also there can be more tension stemming from what is happening. And of course, we would carefully assess what is the impact broadly on the world economy at a time when we are barely striving to recover from the COVID-induced economic crisis. Let me just say something personal. My brother is married to a Ukrainian. They are in Kharkiv. This is a city at the border with Russia. And when I talk to him, I feel so strongly for his family, of course, but for everybody there to wake up to the sounds of bombing and to be unsure about what the next would bring. I I know right now it is so difficult to see a pathway to peace, but peace must be pursued, and we must find a way to bring that peace that people are desperate for.
I appreciate that, and uh, our thoughts and prayers are with your family and for all those families in Ukraine. It is a very serious situation, and as you mentioned, it's one with a really global impact on the economy and on the global economy and far beyond even Europe, for the United States, and for emerging markets, including Africa. History is very much upon us. Um, Dr. Ngozi, just to transition back to sort of, our larger theme about sort of history, and obviously we have a continent that's of Africa that's going to be navigating lots of different issues, including the repercussions from Ukraine, but also the pandemic and the inflation. And we'll get to that. But you are a history maker. I mean, you are familiar with history. Not only are one of our Black History Month speakers, but you are a history maker in your own right and bring a really interesting perspective to the overall conversation. Um, Maybe just taking a step back before we get into all the details, maybe you can get your sense as to your story in your own words, and then what Black history means, both for you over time in your life, but also in the larger um, global moment in which we find ourselves.
Well, thank you, Chris. Before I say that, I'll just say a quick word on the situation in Ukraine, just to second or support Kristalina's words about feeling for the people who are caught up in this in Ukraine and elsewhere, those who will be impacted. But also to say that among the economic impacts, of course, is that of trade. Ukraine is one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. And their inability to export wheat just reminds me of what happened during the food crisis of 2008, 2009, when I was at the World Bank. And people were panicking. And, so the world price of wheat and bread in countries was really increasing at a rapid pace. And Ukraine at that time had held back its wheat exports. And so we had to go to Ukraine to try and persuade them to put the wheat back on the world market so that the prices could come down. And they did that. So my mind just goes back to that. There's going to be a big impact with respect to wheat prices and prices of bread for ordinary people as well. So part of the economic consequence. But like Kristalina was saying, I think the biggest thing is to stand with all the people who are being impacted by this and hope that it will soon be over and there'll be peace. Coming back to the question you asked, it's very difficult when you're worrying about world events and problems to think about making history or being part of history. But I would say that the members of the WTO who actually made history by electing me into this position for the first time, a woman, an African, into the position. And it comes, of course, then with an awful sense of responsibility. But as I look at my trajectory or history, and I look at Black History Month, what comes to my mind is what Henry Louis Gates said, that the thing about Black history is that the truth is so much more complex than you could make up or you could imagine. And when you stand back and look at it and you think about Black history from slavery to apartheid to colonialism, and through all of this, Black people have somehow survived and thrived. What I think about during Black History Month is sheer resilience of Black people and just how proud I am of that, that in spite of all the adversities then and now, Black people can put their heads up. They are still fighting wherever they are, and they're still making history. So that's what it means to me.
Well, we acknowledge and are obviously the world is very proud and acknowledging both, frankly, of the paths that you guys are blazing. We were joking before coming on about what it's like to be a global leader, but both of you are doing just that, and we appreciate that. Kristalina, you've been a treasure to us here over at Georgetown, and again, you're a history maker and have shattered your fair share of ceilings around town, and have a keen sense of history. From your perch at the IMF, when you think about Africa over that last millennium, and we heard Dr. Ngozi sort of bringing up all these different episodes within the history of Africa and its contributions to the economy, from breadbasket of the world, through apartheid to the post-pandemic age. Where is Africa today in the context of the international financial and economic system? And what does the continent, in your view, have going for it? And what are the major challenges?
Let me first say Hoya Saksa to all students and professors at Georgetown
We
University.
love you.
Great to be with you, and great that I'm with Ngozi, someone I respect tremendously, to celebrate Black history and to make my small contribution to the discussion today. Let me first start with a small personal memory. I lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain in Bulgaria, and for a big chunk of my life, I simply have not seen Black people until we hosted in Sofia a youth festival. And there was this column of students from all over the world walking, and a great African woman leading one of the groups. And I was so excited to see that diversity of our planet. So I rushed to her and hugged her. And it felt to me that the world has come to Bulgaria. So my very first message is that diversity is what makes our world rich. And it is this first and foremost important contribution that Africa makes through the diversity, vast diversity of its cultures, its people, and the aspiration they carry. So, what does Africa have going for it? First and foremost, people. This is a youthful continent that is, contrary to the part of the world I come from, Europe, going in demographic terms towards a potential of that youthfulness. And just to look at the numbers, in the beginning of the last century, in 1900, Africa had 140 million people. Well, now we have 1.4 billion, 10 times more. And when I think of the resource of Africa, yes, natural resources are rich, but it is people that I'm particularly excited about. And this is why I dream of Africa that is highly educated with access to opportunities and where men and women can reach their full potential. Of course, Africa also has tremendous growth potential. It is not for no reason that we say 21st century is Africa's century. And before the pandemic, we have seen well-managed African economies growing at a very high speed and diversifying their economies. And of course, last but not least, it is the natural resources of Africa. I think of, for example, DRC. This is a country where most of the lithium we need for batteries is being produced, where we have lungs of our planet that are so valuable. It is a solution country for the green transformation. And of course, Ngozi's own country, because of the population and because of the natural endowment, has a tremendous potential. But in this pandemic, we have seen something very dangerous, and it is this divergence in economic fortunes that came out of low access to vaccines and low fiscal space to support the economies. So for Africa to reach its potential, it needs African leadership for sound fundamentals of countries, and it also needs international cooperation so this potential can be realized.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you look at both the human potential, the people of the continent, when you look at the energy, when you look at the growth, obviously the impact for consumption, and literally the role in global GDP is going to shift. But you do see these other challenges, fiscal and otherwise, in the wake of the of the pandemic. Switching, Director General Dr. Ngozi, I'll give you a chance to offer your perspective as well from your perch over at the WTO. Africa has been involved, like other parts of the world, in these very dramatic attempts to organize more regional coordination in trade, and I suppose some of that is going to be informed, at least in part, from and by this post-pandemic economy, but it's been happening well in advance. I mean, when you look at the big picture, how do you view these efforts, and how are they defining Africa's place in the international trading system, and for that matter, the WTO?
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And one of the reasons I enjoy being in a panel or working with Kristalina is that she articulates so nicely so many of the things that we want to say. So I'll just build on what Kristalina has said. Incidentally, we've been colleagues and friends for many, many years. So maybe that's why we can finish off each other's sentences sometimes. But coming to your point, I'm here at the WTO. Part of the reason I was excited to take the job is because I believe in the potential of trade to help transform economies. And from the vantage point of where I sit, I think that Africa has not benefited the way it should from world trade. Africa's share of world trade pre-pandemic was just 3%. With the pandemic, it's falling to about 2.4%. So it's even shrinking. And this is why it's exciting for us to see what the continent is doing with trade. And of course, you mentioned regional integration, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the largest agreement in terms of numbers of countries involved in the world, and then has the potential to have a market of the 1.4 billion, 1.3, 1.4 billion people that Kristalina mentioned. Now, I said Africa's share of world trade is low. Africa's share of intra-regional trade is also low, about 15%. So Africa trades more with the outside than with itself, which is why this regional agreement is important. If Africa can integrate better, it stands a better chance when it trades with itself of also improving people's incomes and living standards. Some work done by the the UN Economic Commission for Africa shows that when Africa trades with itself, it tends to trade more manufactured goods, more value-added goods. When it trades with the outside, it's primarily raw materials and commodities. So it stands to reason that if we can improve inside trade, we can create more jobs for that young population that Kristalina was talking about earlier. That's why it's exciting. I think the potential for a large market, for job creation, for value addition in many sectors is really, really a big one. And if Africa can seize that opportunity, many things can happen. Let me just illustrate. One area that is exciting for us now in this pandemic is the push, including with Kristalina and the World Bank President David Malpass and the WHO DG, Dr. Tedros. We've been working together to try to work with manufacturers of vaccines to understand what's happening to production, to try and push for decentralized manufacturing in Africa. Why is that? Because the continent imports 90% of its medicines and 99% of its vaccines. And we have seen that in this pandemic, politics trumps human thoughts. When countries get caught, they'll rather keep their vaccines to themselves than export it elsewhere. So what do you have to do with that? You have to encourage manufacturing on the continent. And so with this 1.3 billion people, we can encourage the setup of a pharmaceutical industry on the continent. We no longer should we be importing such huge quantities of basics that we need. So that is one of the exciting areas we can even think of. How can we have an ecosystem for a pharmaceutical industry in the continent? One country manufacturing some parts, another one doing fill and finish, another one doing another set of equipment related to pharmaceuticals or to vaccines. So that's like a dream. And this is just one industry. I can think of many others. Now, to finish, of course, to realize that dream, we have many barriers at the moment. Infrastructural barriers, bureaucratic ones that we have to overcome. You know, long lines of lorries at the borders now that we have to look at. People crossing and moving freely. I want to see the One Africa passport of the AU come to light. I meant to bring it to show you I have one, and I forgot. I'm very proud of it. If we can issue it to every African citizen, that can make movement much easier for people and then eventually for goods. So a dream and digitization. You know, we need to digitize trade and it's beginning to happen. So we need to push on that. To end, the prospects are fantastic. The World Bank has estimated that if we do this properly, it could result in $450 billion additional of income to people on the continent. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that all this will happen.
Can I just sort of push just one line further on that answer, which was very extensive. When you think about the WTO, right, which itself is a bit at a crossroads, and you're seeing all of this work at regional integration, but also global integration. Well, the WTO is like other great institutions in a process and in the midst of rethinking how it works, and a bit of rethinking even underway with regards to dispute settlement. What do you see as the biggest challenges that the WTO faces, and how do you view those challenges, the challenges of the WTO, as impacting conversations on Africa?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, there are a few challenges that the WTO is facing at the moment. And one of the things that I'm really trying to do with the members is to see how we reform the organization, including what you alluded to, the dispute settlement system, which is the only place in the world where countries can bring trade disputes with each other. But it's part of it has been paralyzed, and I don't want to take too much time going into the story. So we have to reform it and reinvigorate it. But that's a big challenge. To me, the biggest challenge we face here is bringing the institution up to the 21st century. Things are changing very rapidly in trade, but some of our rules have not changed. They need to be modernized. And we have areas where rules are missing, and this is where I can talk about the impact on the continent. I believe the future of trade is digital, but we do not, and we've seen in this pandemic how e-commerce has really blossomed and digital trade. But today we don't have any rules that underpin global trade. And that means that poorer countries, smaller countries will have a less easy time penetrating the trading system digitally. It's the bigger countries who have all the means and so on who can survive. So if right now, I can say that 86 of our members are negotiating an e-commerce agreement. And I'm very excited about that, because if we can get that done, that means that digital trade will have fair and level playing field rules that underpin it. There'll be more stability and certainty for countries in Africa to trade. And particularly, we found that small and medium enterprises and women are benefiting greatly from digital trade. And this is what the continent is all about. We are made up of small and medium enterprises. We're made up of women entrepreneurs. So this is just one illustration of one area where I think the WTO's challenge, if we can overcome it, can really be beneficial to the continent. And I could go on. I mean, another challenge is how to go green. And I'm saying it because I know this is a favorite area of Kristalina. Many people see trade as part of the problem for solving climate change, which is greatly impacting the African continent. Everybody knows that only the continent contributes or contributed only 3% to carbon emissions, but we are seeing so much drought, flood, unprecedented. In my own village, you know, farmers are puzzled. They don't know when to plant anymore, when to harvest because of climate change. But trade can help that. Trade can help spread technologies, green technologies, to those areas that don't have it, so that they can begin to adapt. If we can get an agreement to lower tariffs on environmental goods and services, this is also something that can be contributed and would benefit the continent. So in just those two areas, digital and green, we need to update our rules. We need to put rules that are not there. And it's quite exciting to think about it.
You know, so many things in that answer, so many things that frankly spoke to me and speak to me personally, because you know, and we in the United States are working on lots of digital issues, and we may circle back to that kind of a conversation. You know, how do you update rules for these next generation issues, which is very difficult. Managing director, you know, just switching to the series of challenges that institutions face, and really to your earlier answer, you know, when you look across the world, whether it be Africa or whether it be the United States, you know, the effects of the pandemic are palpable. I mean, in part, the digital transformation is itself a reflection of the need to go digital in the wake of the pandemic. But when you think about struggles with supply chains and obviously to digital transformation of the economies, you know, in your view, how has COVID transformed or impacted the conversation on economic growth at the IMF?
It is a crisis like no other. Never before the world was faced with a sudden stop of economic activities across the globe. What we did at the IMF was to, very early in the crisis, correctly diagnose the economic impact. In other words, the need to stop both production and consumption, and what is necessary to do to sustain economies in this very unusual environment. And we came up with an advice that you don't often hear from the IMF, and it was spend, but keep the receipts. We ourselves contributed to increasing the spending capacity in especially low-income countries, together with the World Bank that has also extended large-scale financing. The fund provided swiftly emergency financing to our members, and almost everybody in Africa benefited from this swift response. We also came up with a largest in our history allocation of special drawing rights. This is the reserve asset of the IMF. It does not add to debt, but it adds to reserve and financial capacity. $650 billion. We are now working on trying to amplify the impact of this allocation by asking countries that got these SDRs but don't need them to on lend to countries in need. And when we look at the transformation at the IMF, what I would recognize is that we also quickly came to assessing the negative and the positive impacts from COVID-19. On the negative side, inequality has increased. In many, many countries, this is a she session. It has impacted women who are in the contact industries, lost jobs, or in the healthcare industries were impacted by the virus more. Or just because nobody could provide childcare anymore, they had to leave their jobs. So we have seen a massive departure of women, including in Africa. And let's remember, women globally fall 20% short of the labor market participation of men. So this inequality is now taking front and center a role in our policy advice to countries. Secondly, we recognize that if before the pandemic we were talking about the future being digital, with the pandemic the future has arrived. and therefore supporting countries to digitalize and thinking about the role of digital money more rapidly injected in our economic lives than before. So that is, in a way, a positive, but also somewhat negative, because if you are falling behind, digitalization may make you fall even further behind if you are not catching up on it. And of course, we are now dealing with the impact of actions to arrest the economic fallout, more specifically, inflation. We have seen that demand increased very rapidly, but interruption of supply chains and the fact nobody expected that with vaccines we would unleash demand so quickly, that is impacting prices. On top of it, we see a massive shift of consumer demand from services to goods. And that impacts the push on prices as well. But then to deal with inflation, central banks need to step forward and tighten up financial conditions. When they do that, the other problem that we built in during the pandemic, debt, because for good reason, countries and businesses had to borrow more, this debt is now becoming more expensive. So for the IMF, the most important task we have is to carefully understand the complication of factors in each individual country, because we are not anymore in 2020 when everybody was impacted the same way and everybody's action was the same. Now we have different countries at different stages of recovery, different combination of the factors I described, and therefore policies have to be calibrated much more to country-specific conditions. And when I think of Africa, what has happened in Africa is the drag backwards from the pandemic is causing a risk of Africa reaching its full potential. We estimate that the financial gap in Africa today, just to catch up with the pre-pandemic growth path and to cure the impact of the pandemic, is in the order of $450 billion. Now, Africa can mobilize some resources domestically, but clearly it needs international support to step up. And finally, something that we have to talk about, what the pandemic has done is to divert global attention from other problems, and in particular from the problem of insecurity. In the Sahel, in Central African Republic, in the Horn of Africa, Sudan, we see insecurity building up. And yet, what could have been in the past concentrated international attention is now somewhat lagging behind. So I feel that for us at the fund, we have globally so much to do, so much to understand, appreciate, and bring responses to. But when it comes down to Africa, we have an even higher responsibility because of the fragility of recovery in many countries, and yet the enormous potential of Africa. So we concentrate to work with Africa, with African institutions, with African leaders, and for Africa.
So I note to myself to just have you teach my class, because that was a very effective and extremely clear outlining of just sort of how different kinds of choices have ripple effects, and that how policymakers have to adapt and adjust, to those changes in the economy, and that was really great. And I may circle back for sure to that question on digital currencies in a moment, but Dr. Ngozi, I want to give you also a chance to sort of respond to this these set of factors. You yourself have brought up the question of digitalization, but we also have these larger macroeconomic forces like inflation that are really forcing policymakers to rethink what their policy responses will be. I mean, when you look at the changing nature of the economy, still high GDP growth globally, still as we've just heard, the need for continued bespoke solutions on country by country basis. But again, against this larger backdrop of inflation, I mean, where do you think the WTO in particular sees its sweet spots for leaning in and sort of confronting some of the major macroeconomic challenges that the world is now facing?
Well, Chris, let me say that one of the things that worries us and worries me at the WTO is the issue of divergence that Kristalina spoke about. What she is seeing at the IMF in terms of the GDP growth numbers, of some parts of the world or some countries recovering faster and others trailing behind, is what we also see in our trade numbers. We see some regions of the world like North America, Europe, Asia, the trade is rebounding much faster in those areas, whereas in Latin America, Middle East, and Africa, it is much less so. And Africa, of all those, is most impacted. So that divergence is a source for worry. As we were saying in the beginning, pre-pandemic, the world was kind of converging in terms of growth, although there were still some countries in Africa left behind. Now it's worse because it's diverging, and Africa is at the low end of that divergence. So that really worries us when we look at the trade numbers at the WTO, and we try to look at what can be done. How can Africa tap into the external demand outside of those economies that are rebounding faster by trading with them? Because this is one of the ways that our economies can also benefit from the rebound elsewhere. And what can we ourselves do to make sure that some of the trade aspects of this work? Now, one area in which the WTO can lean in is in the area of supply chains. Supply chains have become such a popular word now. Many people didn't think about it before, but we've all now seen that whether it's for the manufacture of certain products or to receive certain goods, supply chains matter. And supply chains are stuck because the demand exceeded expectations due to all the fiscal stimulation that was given during the pandemic. And those in the shipping and logistics were thinking the world was going to go into a great recession or depression or whatever you want to call it. And so they reduced investment in logistics and left containers in different places. So that mismatch, demand rebounded, supply could not keep up, has led to some of these supply chain snafus and waits that we see. So that area of monitoring what happens to supply chains is one of the areas that the WTO can actually help play a role. We have a monitoring and transparency function. We can look at the trade facilitation measures that will help move supply chains faster. We can look at export restrictions and prohibitions that our members put in place, which may stop supply chains from functioning better. And so we are actively doing that. Let me just give you an example. At the start of the pandemic, our members had 109 export restrictions in place. And the job is to monitor this and try and bring it down. So we are not part of the problem. We're actually part of the solution. And these restrictions, by monitoring that, by being transparent and knowing what members have these restrictions, we've been able to work to bring them down to 35 today over the course of this pandemic. And I think that is quite important. So I say it because people are only just realizing how important supply chains are. And this organization is one of those that makes supply chains flow better. So that's one area that the WTO can really play a strong role and has been doing that. Let me just mention one other thing to do with supply chains. You know, all of us are worried about these supply chains, but I was sitting here brainstorming with my staff, and interestingly, we saw an opportunity in what is happening now. Because of all the worries about supply chains, about what is happening to businesses because of this, you see businesses trying to manage their risks differently. So people have been talking a lot about reshoring, the fact that all these problems are going to make businesses bring manufacturing back home. Yes, some of that is happening. But what we're seeing more of in our data is nearshoring, moving to other nearby countries from China to Vietnam, Bangladesh, for example, even to Ethiopia. We're seeing more of that, and we're seeing inventory accumulation. What we're thinking about here is how can we use this risk management to favor regions that are left behind. If you're going to near shore to other countries, why not to Africa? They started in Ethiopia. Why don't we draw Senegal in, and Rwanda and Nigeria? You know, these countries can put their houses in order. This is something we are thinking of. So there's opportunity where people see distress. And I've been calling this re-globalization. We can use trade and this supply chain issue to re-globalize the world and bring in those countries that are marginalized back into the mainstream.
That is fantastic, and really, you know, by the way, by pointing to the supply chain issues, it's very interesting. I mean, it's positioning the WTO in that conversation, in the larger macroeconomic conversation about inflation as well. You know, I want to get to our student questions, but I did want to ask one last thing, because Kristalina, you know, you tempted me, you know, by talking about you know, digital assets and CBDCs. I mean, just really briefly, I mean, how do you view the central bank digital currency development? Are there any particular thoughts that you may have, both in the wake of the pandemic, or recent developments, or frankly in the context of Africa, about CBDCs and the work of the IMF?
We are very clearly in a fast-changing environment when it comes down to digital money. We did a survey of our membership asking countries whether they are engaged in CBDCs, and over 100 responded positively. They are either in early stages of just exploring CBDCs, or they are moving into a pilot phase, or as it is the case with the Bahamas, Nigeria, they are already actively using CBDCs. Of the pilot countries, the biggest pilot is in China. It has 128 million participants, and is moving forward very, very rapidly. So is the pilot in Sweden and in other places. So CBDCs is no more of question whether. The question is when and how. And there, the number one issue for us at the IMF is to make sure that there is interoperability of different central bank digital currencies. So we don't go back into a world in which these national central bank digital currencies cannot easily talk with each other. And that question of interoperability does put institutions like the Bank for International Settlement, they're very much ahead on this topic, but also the IMF and others into a position of ensuring that global collaboration expands with the same or faster speed that national engagements in this area. But let's not forget the private currencies. The stable coins, the e-money like M-Pesa in Kenya, that have taken off so rapidly, and for them the pandemic is a big boost. There, the most important issue, Chris, is regulation. It is like money market funds. They have to be regulated to protect the users. And then, of course, we have the Bitcoins and other crypto that are called currencies, but they're not quite exactly the same thing as money. But that is a debate that can take us forever. So I'm not going to go there. And of course, for Africa, very important to be ahead, as M-Pesa has been. But let's not forget that to make use of digital money, there is a very important prerequisite, and it is called access to electricity. With 600 million Africans still not having that access guaranteed, obviously we can advance digitalization, but it has to be in the broader aspect of advancing development.
It's a fascinating answer, and yes, it can take all day or all a semester to discuss the definition of money. I do it all every year, and that's still not enough time. But speaking of, I did want to at least give the opportunity for a couple of student questions. We asked our student body, for a couple of interesting questions for you, and very briefly, I'll try to ask first the one from Allison Reading, a Georgetown law student, who asks, given that many countries in Africa and elsewhere increased their lending during the pandemic and interest rates are now rising, from traditional multilateral sources and even China, should public creditors consider debt relief for pandemic loans to avert a debt crisis? And what role is there for the trading system in helping to address imbalances? So it looks like you've both kind of previewed parts of that answer, but still very relevant questions. Good question, Allison. I guess I'll start with the managing director.
What often makes me lose sleep overnight is the debt situation over the world, but especially in low-income countries, and especially in low-income countries in Africa. In 2015, less than 30% of low-income countries were in debt distress or close to it. Today, it is about 60%. And what we lack is a strong discipline of early debt resolution that would make a debt problem of a country not to break the bank of this country. We have done two important things together with the president of the World Bank. We called for debt service suspension during the pandemic, and this initiative did provide breathing space for countries that have chosen to participate. It meant that they didn't have to pay their loans, but it expired. We at the IMF have provided debt relief to our poorest members. In other words, we gave grant money so they don't have to pay us during the height of the pandemic. We also, as I said, we issued special drawing rights, which is a way to give reserves the countries that do not add to debt. But where we are particularly concerned is that the initiative put forward called Common Framework for Debt Resolution by the G20 today only has 3 countries asking for it. Why? Because it is slow to move and because there is no clear incentive for countries to ask. They might lose access to markets if they haven't already lost it. Therefore, we are strongly urging the members of the Common Framework, both traditional donors and non-traditional donors like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and the private sector, please treat this with a sense of urgency. We need incentive for countries to participate. In other words, if they ask for treatment under Common Framework, they should immediately get debt service suspension rights. And we need clear process with beginning and end and steps in between that are followed so countries know what to expect when they step into the framework. Otherwise, it will be more expensive for everybody because debt issues that are not resolved in a timely manner become a real burden on countries for a long time. We at the IMF continue to think of ways in which we can inject a stronger momentum on the issue of debt resolution. And Chris, I want to thank the student for caring about it. It is truly a serious problem many countries face.
Dr. Ngozi.
Yeah, let me
To
add
the
to, sorry?
Yes,
Should
yes.
I go
For
ahead? Yeah.
your response to that question and the international trading system, and
Yes.
obviously your experience as a finance minister is interesting.
And the trade imbalances. Well, during the
Hmm.
pandemic, one of the things we've worried about trade is, of course, what happens to the private sector on the African continent. It's the private sector that does most of the trading. And unlike rich countries where they had a lot of liquidity support and forbearance from governments and even forgiveness of loans and so on and so forth, or grants and loans, soft loans. Many African countries were not in a position to do this. Some did do. Many tried to do things along these lines, and I know that in several countries there were tax breaks, there was some forbearance, there were longer lead times to pay back loans. So countries did try. But a part of the problem with trying to redress imbalances is that you must have something to sell, and you must be able to have financing to sell that. So trade finance has also been a problem, particularly for poorer countries, the least developed countries on the continent, in the Sahel, and so on. So that's what we've been watching and trying to see what governments are doing, what can be done to help support the private sector. How can we work with others? We are not a financial institution. So, but we know what is happening with trade. So we can go to partner with the IFC, for example, which is one of the things we've been doing, talking to the International Finance Corporation to say, here's a gap in this country. They don't have access to trade finance, particularly during this pandemic. What can you do to help so that those who want to export cotton from Burkina Faso or from Mali and so on can do that? So those are the things we've been looking at, seeing where we can partner to support countries, support the private sector to help redress those trade imbalances so that indeed the poor countries can tap into the external demands they will see in Asia or Europe or North America.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Unfortunately, I am very well aware of the fact that I have two global history makers in your own right. But I want to maybe end with a last sort of final question, really to both of you. I mean, you're important in lots of different ways, and you're both history makers in your own right. And as I said at the outset, you both very much appreciate the pull of history. For each of you, when you leave your post, what do you hope that you'll be remembered for? After your departure, what would you like your legacy to ultimately be? And I'll start with the managing director.
Well, we live in a more shock-prone world, and the shocks that affect the global economy are more diverse. The pandemic is a clear example, but we also face climate shocks. We face geopolitical shocks, and that makes the fund an institution that has to continue to evolve as it has done in the past. What I hope is that my legacy, and I'm saying that very with great humility, it is for the great staff of the fund to carry that forward, is that we will have a systemically relevant institution, as it has been in the past, in building resilience to a more shock-prone world, and being more inclusive for all its members, for all the people that form our countries. Internally in the fund, I do hope to leave my mark in inclusion and diversity. So we at the fund are like the world that forms our membership, men and women of all races and all ethnicity that is applying to serve the membership, that we have space for it. We have done a great advancements in today having for the first time in our history, 3 women out of the 5 people that are at the very top of the fund, very diverse women, one of them from Africa. During the last 2 years, we hired 50% women, and very importantly, we hired very diverse people. And I think that if we are diverse like the world, we would do very well for the world.
Dr. Ngozi.
Well, what I would like to be remembered for is for helping to move the WTO as an organization towards becoming an institution that is fit for purpose for 21st century issues. To do that, I want the organization to be more results oriented, to deliver more. I want to be remembered for that, because one of the problems we have is in closing agreements. So I really would like it if, before I leave this place, we could, one, close on how we respond to this pandemic and the future ones. 2, we close on a sustainability agreement, the fisheries subsidies, which will result in stopping overfishing and overcapacity, in reducing it. This is big for 260 million people who are fishermen and women in the world. So even those two, being remembered for results, for contributing to things that make a difference in the life of people. Adding to that, I want to be remembered for bringing the WTO and the staff and members back to the original purpose of the organization, which somehow seems to have been forgotten over the years. The WTO's purpose, as enshrined in its agreement, is to enhance living standards, help create employment, and support sustainable development. And what this says is that the WTO is about people. But when people think about the WTO, they never believe that this organization is about people. They think it's about trade, which is not helpful to poor people, marginalizes people. But that was not what this organization was supposed to do. So I would like to have a legacy of having been able to contribute to reversing the image, to getting results, to bringing energy and interest and light back to the institution. Thank you.
So the conclusion
Well,
is, when you have women in charge, they think about people. And
I
Ngozi,
will.
bravo.
Let me just say
Bravo
for
to
both
you
of you,
and to Chris.
this conversation is one that I'm never going to forget. I am proud of you both, and yeah, for your brilliance and your humanity. Because your institutions are ultimately about people. And on behalf of Georgetown and our students, myself, thank you so much for this time. I know your time is so valuable, and this meant a lot to me and to a lot of people, and we really do appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Nice to bring Kristalina and I together again. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye, Ngozi. Bye, Chris. Thank you.